The cold morning air hit Sergeant Jake Morrison's face as he climbed out of his Sherman tank. His hands were still shaking, not from fear but from anger at himself. Another mission, another failure. The French countryside around him was quiet now, but just 2 hours ago it had been hell. Jake sat on the tank's hull and looked at the muddy ground. His crew stayed inside, not saying anything. They all knew what was coming. Lieutenant Davis would arrive soon, and he would not be happy. It was September 1944. The Allied forces had pushed deep into France after the D-Day landings in June. Everyone thought the war would end soon. But the Germans were not giving up. They fought hard for every town, every bridge, every field. And Jake's tank crew was supposed to help win those fights, but they were failing. The problem was simple but deadly. Jake could not hit targets from long range. When German positions were far away, his shots missed. Sometimes by a little, sometimes by a lot. It did not matter how carefully he aimed. The shells just did not go where he wanted them to go. This morning's mission was supposed to be easy. Intelligence reports said a German machine gun nest was hiding in a farmhouse about 800 yards away. The infantry needed that position destroyed before they could advance. Jake's tank was sent to do the job. He had fired 6 shells, 6 expensive heavy shells. Not one hit the farmhouse. The German gunners inside must have been laughing. Finally, another Sherman tank had to move up and finish the job. Jake's commander had radioed back to base with the bad news. Now Jake waited. He pulled out a cigarette but did not light it. His loader, Private Tommy Chen, stuck his head out of the tank. Tommy was young, just 19 years old. He had kind eyes that looked worried. "Sarge, you okay?" Tommy asked. "Yeah, kid. Just thinking," Jake replied. "It's not your fault. Maybe the gun is broken or something," Tommy said, trying to help. Jake appreciated the thought, but he knew better. The tank's gun had been checked 3 times. The mechanic said everything worked perfectly. The problem had to be Jake. Maybe he was just a bad gunner. Their driver, Corporal Mike Rodriguez, climbed out too. Mike was from Texas and always tried to keep spirits high. "Hey, at least we didn't get hit today. That's a win in my book." "Not hitting the enemy is not a win, Mike," Jake said quietly. Before Mike could respond, they heard a jeep approaching. Lieutenant Davis jumped out before the vehicle even stopped completely. Davis was a tall man with a sharp face and sharper words. He walked straight to Jake. "Morrison, we need to talk. Now," Davis said. Jake stood up and followed Davis away from the tank. The other crew members watched nervously. Davis stopped about 20 yards away and turned to face Jake. His expression was hard. "Sergeant, this can't continue. That's the 4th mission this month where you failed to hit long-range targets," Davis said, his voice cold and controlled. "Sir, I know. I'm trying to figure out what's wrong," Jake started to explain. "Trying isn't good enough. Men are dying because you can't do your job. Infantry is getting pinned down because enemy positions aren't being eliminated. Do you understand what that means?" Davis interrupted. Jake felt the words like punches. He did understand. Every mission he failed meant soldiers on the ground faced more danger. It meant more American boys might not go home. The weight of it crushed down on him. "Sir, give me more time. I'll fix this," Jake pleaded. Davis looked at him for a long moment. Finally, he sighed. "You have 1 week, Morrison. 1 week to figure out what's wrong. If you can't improve, I'm requesting a new gunner for this crew. Understood?" "Yes, sir," Jake said, his stomach tight. Davis walked back to his jeep and drove away. Jake stood there alone for a moment, staring at nothing. 1 week. 7 days to save his position, his reputation, his purpose. He walked back to the tank. The crew looked at him with questions in their eyes, but nobody spoke. Jake climbed back onto the Sherman and sat in the gunner's position. He looked through the sight, checking the mechanisms for the 100th time. Everything seemed normal. But then something strange happened. Their tank suddenly lurched backward. Mike had accidentally hit the reverse while doing maintenance checks. The Sherman rolled back about 10 feet before Mike stopped it. Jake, still looking through his sight, noticed something odd. As the tank moved in reverse, his view through the sight seemed more stable. Smoother somehow. "Sorry, Sarge. My foot slipped," Mike called out. "It's okay." "Do that again," Jake said suddenly. "What? Go backwards?" Mike asked, confused. "Yeah. Just reverse slowly for about 20 feet, Jake ordered. Mike shrugged and followed the order. The tank rolled backward. Jake kept his eye on the sight, watching carefully. There it was again. That smooth, stable feeling. It was different from when they moved forward. Jake's mind started racing. For months he had noticed something weird. Whenever they backed up the tank during repositioning, his aim felt different. Better, maybe. But that did not make sense. Tanks were designed to fight moving forward, not backward. He climbed out and walked around the Sherman, studying it from every angle. The gun, the turret, the stabilization system, the tracks, everything looked normal. But looks could be deceiving. Tommy joined him. "What are you thinking about, Sarge?" "Something's wrong with this tank, Tommy. I just need to figure out what," Jake said. "The mechanics checked it." "They said it's fine," Tommy reminded him. "Then maybe the mechanics are wrong, or maybe they're checking the wrong things," Jake replied. That night, Jake could not sleep. He lay in his tent staring at the canvas ceiling. His mind kept returning to that moment when the tank reversed, that feeling of stability, of control. It meant something. He just had to figure out what 1 week. He had 1 week to solve this mystery. 1 week to prove he was not a failure. 1 week to save his crew and maybe, just maybe, help win this war. The answer was there, hiding in plain sight. Jake Morrison just needed to find it. And he would, even if it meant doing something nobody had ever tried before. 3 days had passed since Lieutenant Davis gave Jake his ultimatum. 3 days of frustration, worry, and sleepless nights. Jake Morrison had become obsessed with his theory about the tank's reverse movement. His crew thought he was losing his mind. It was early morning and the tank battalion was taking a rare rest day. Most crews were relaxing, writing letters home or playing cards. But Jake had other plans. He had convinced his crew to take their Sherman to an abandoned field about 2 miles from camp. The field was empty except for an old destroyed barn and some wooden fence posts. Perfect for what Jake wanted to do. "Sarge, are you sure about this? If Lieutenant Davis finds out we took the tank without permission, we're all in trouble," Mike said nervously as he drove the Sherman across the bumpy terrain. "Davis said I have a week to fix the problem." "This is how I fix it," Jake replied from the gunner's position inside the turret. Tommy was loading shells while their tank commander, Corporal James "Jimmy" Walker, watched from the commander's hatch. Jimmy was a quiet man from Ohio who usually let Jake run the show when it came to gunnery. He trusted Jake, even when others did not. "What exactly are we doing out here?" Jimmy asked. Jake took a deep breath. "I'm going to test something crazy. For the past 3 months I've noticed something weird. When our tank moves forward, my shots are off. But when we reverse, everything feels more stable through the sight. I think there's a problem with the forward stabilization system. But the mechanics checked everything," Tommy pointed out again. "Yeah, they checked if the parts work, but maybe they didn't check if they work correctly. Maybe there's a tiny flaw that only shows up during actual firing," Jake explained. The Sherman came to a stop in the middle of the field. Jake had Tommy place several wooden posts at different distances: 200 yards, 400 yards, 600 yards, and 800 yards. The 800-yard posts were barely visible. "Okay, here's the test. First, I'll fire at those posts with the tank in normal forward position. Then we'll turn around and I'll try firing while facing backward," Jake announced. "Facing backward? How does that even work?" Mike asked, completely confused. "I'll have to adjust all my calculations. Reverse the angles, compensate differently for the tank's movement. It'll be complicated, but I think I can do it," Jake said. Jimmy shook his head but smiled slightly. "Morrison, you're either brilliant or completely insane. Let's find out which one." Jake started with the normal setup. Tank facing forward, gunner position standard. He aimed carefully at the closest post 200 yards away. He had fired thousands of practice rounds in training. He knew what he was doing. He squeezed the trigger. The cannon roared. The shell screamed through the air. It hit about 3 feet to the left of the post. Close, but not good enough. He tried the 400-yard post. The shell landed 5 feet short. The 600-yard attempt missed by almost 10 feet. The 800-yard shot was not even close. Jake's heart sank. The same problem. Always the same problem. He climbed out of the turret and sat on the hull, his head in his hands. Maybe he really was just a bad gunner. Maybe Davis was right to replace him. "Hey, don't give up yet. Try the backward thing," Tommy encouraged. Jake looked up at his young loader. Tommy believed in him even when he did not believe in himself. That meant something. "All right, let's do this," Jake said, standing up. Mike turned the Sherman around so the rear faced the targets. This was already unusual. Tanks were not designed to fight this way. The armor was thinner in the back. The position was awkward, but Jake was desperate. He climbed back into the gunner's position, but now everything was reversed. He had to completely change how he calculated angles and distances. His brain hurt trying to work out the new math. It took him almost 15 minutes to make his first shot calculation. Okay, targeting the 200-yard post. Here goes nothing, Jake said. The cannon fired. Everyone held their breath. The wooden post exploded into splinters. Direct hit, holy, you actually hit it. Mike yelled excitedly. Could be luck. Try another. Jimmy said calmly. But Jake could hear the excitement in his voice too. Jake aimed at the 400-yard post, adjusting his backward calculations. Another roar from the cannon. Another direct hit. The post shattered. That's not luck, Tommy whispered. Jake's hands were shaking now, but from excitement, not fear. He aimed at the 600-yard post. His calculations were getting faster as his brain adjusted to the backward method. Fire. Direct hit. Jake, try the 800-yard one. That's the distance you always miss at, Jimmy urged. 800 yards. The distance where Jake had failed mission after mission. The distance that had almost ended his career. He looked through his sight, made his calculations, adjusted for wind and the tank's position. His finger rested on the trigger. He remembered every missed shot, every disappointed look from Lieutenant Davis, every moment he had let his crew down, every infantry soldier who had faced extra danger because Jake could not do his job. Not anymore. He fired. The shell flew through the air in a perfect arc. It struck the distant post dead center, obliterating it completely. For a moment, nobody said anything. They all just stared at where the post had been. Then Mike started whooping with joy. Tommy was laughing and slapping the inside of the tank. Even Jimmy was grinning from ear to ear. You did it. You actually figured it out, Tommy shouted, but Jake was not celebrating. He was thinking. His theory was correct. Something about the tank's forward stabilization system was flawed. When he reversed everything and compensated for it, his accuracy was perfect. Better than perfect, actually. Suddenly, a voice called out from behind them. What the hell is going on here? They all turned. Lieutenant Davis was standing 50 yards away next to his jeep, arms crossed, watching them. How long had he been there? Jake's stomach dropped. They had taken the tank without permission. They were all about to be in serious trouble. Davis walked toward them slowly. His face was unreadable. When he reached the Sherman, he looked up at Jake, who was still in the turret. Did you just hit targets at 800 yards, Morrison? Davis asked. Yes, sir, Jake replied quietly. While facing backward, Davis continued, Yes, sir. Davis was quiet for a long moment. Then, to everyone's surprise, a small smile appeared on his face. Show me how you did it. Right now, Davis ordered, but his voice was not angry. It was curious. Jake climbed down and spent the next hour explaining his discovery to Davis. He showed the lieutenant the difference between forward and backward firing. He explained his theory about the stabilization flaw. He demonstrated his adjusted calculations. Davis watched everything carefully. When Jake finished, the lieutenant walked around the tank several times, thinking hard. This is either the craziest thing I've ever seen, or you've just solved a problem that's been costing us missions for months. Davis finally said, We need to test this properly. Tomorrow morning, I'm arranging an official demonstration at the training range. If you can replicate these results with observers watching, we might have something here. Jake felt hope surge through him. Yes, sir. I can do it. Davis started to walk back to his jeep, then stopped and turned around. Morrison, one more thing. Don't ever take a tank out without permission again. Understood. Sir, Jake said, trying not to smile. As Davis drove away, the crew gathered around Jake. They were all grinning like crazy. Dude, you might have just changed everything, Mike said. Jake looked at his Sherman tank, sitting there in the field with its gun pointing the wrong way. Maybe Mike was right. Maybe this backward setup was more than just a solution to his problem. Maybe it was something that could help other crews too. But first, he had to prove it worked. Tomorrow's demonstration would be the real test. Jake Morrison had one chance to show everyone that sometimes the answer to a problem is looking at it from a completely different direction, even if that direction was backward. The morning sun barely broke through the clouds as Jake Morrison stood next to his Sherman tank at the training range. His stomach was tight with nerves. Word had spread fast about his crazy backward firing technique, and now it seemed like half the battalion had come to watch. Lieutenant Davis was there, along with Captain Henderson, the battalion commander. There were also 2 mechanics, a gunnery instructor, and crews from at least 5 other tanks. Some looked curious. Others looked like they were waiting to see Jake fail so they could laugh about it later. Morrison's finally lost it. Jake heard someone whisper behind him. "Guy thinks he's smarter than the engineers who designed these tanks." Another voice added with a chuckle. Jake tried to ignore them. He focused on his crew who stood nearby looking nervous but supportive. Tommy gave him a thumbs up. Mike nodded encouragement. Jimmy just stood calmly, confident in his gunner. Captain Henderson walked up to Jake. He was an older man, maybe 45, with gray hair and a serious face. He had seen combat in North Africa before coming to France. He was not the type to waste time on nonsense. "Sergeant Morrison, Lieutenant Davis tells me you have an unconventional solution to your accuracy problems. I'm here to see if it works or if it's just desperation," Henderson said bluntly. "Yes, sir, it works. I can prove it," Jake replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "The United States Army spent millions of dollars and years of research developing the Sherman tank's gun stabilization system." "You're claiming it's flawed?" Henderson asked, raising an eyebrow. "Not flawed, sir. Just not perfect in some tanks. I think mine has a small defect that throws off the stabilization when moving forward. By firing backward and adjusting my calculations, I compensate for that defect," Jake explained. Henderson looked skeptical. "Show me." The test was simple. 15 targets at various distances from 200 to 1,000 yards. Jake had to hit them using his backwards setup. The targets were marked with numbers painted on wooden boards. Jake had to hit them in order. First, they ran a control test. Jake fired at the targets using the normal forward position. Just like always, his shots were close but not accurate enough. Out of 15 targets, he only hit 6 directly. The other 9 were misses, some by several feet. The watching tankers murmured. Some looked satisfied, like this confirmed what they already thought about Jake. "Not impressive, Sergeant," Henderson said. "Now show me this backward method." Mike turned the Sherman around so the rear faced the targets. Jake climbed into the gunner's position. From outside, it looked ridiculous. The tank was facing the wrong way. Everything about it seemed wrong. Jake closed his eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. This was it. His career, his reputation, maybe even his contribution to winning the war, all depended on the next few minutes. He opened his eyes and looked through his sight. Everything was reversed, but he had spent all night practicing the calculations in his head. He knew what to do. "Target 1, 200 yards, Jake called out. Tommy loaded the shell. Jake aimed, adjusted, compensated. Fire. The target exploded. Direct hit. A few people in the crowd made surprised noises. Target 2. 300 yards, Jake continued. Fire, another direct hit. Target 3. 400 yards. Fire. Direct hit again. Now the crowd was paying attention. The murmuring grew louder. Jake blocked it all out. He was in his zone now, the place where only he and the target existed. Target after target fell. 500 yards, direct hit. 600 yards, direct hit. 700 yards, center mass. 800 yards, perfect shot. By the time Jake reached target 12 at 900 yards, the crowd was completely silent. Everyone was watching in disbelief. This was not supposed to be possible. Tank gunnery at this distance was difficult even under perfect conditions, and Jake was doing it facing backward. Target 13, 950 yards, Jake announced. This was beyond the normal effective range for a Sherman tank. At this distance, accuracy was more luck than skill for most gunners. But Jake had his system now. He understood his tank's quirk and how to use it. He calculated wind speed, distance, the slight angle of the ground. His finger squeezed the trigger. The cannon roared. The shell flew in a high arc. 2 seconds later, target 13 disintegrated. Someone in the crowd actually gasped. Target 14, 1,000 yards, Jake said, his voice steady. 1,000 yards. Over half a mile. The target was barely visible. In real combat, hitting anything at this distance would be considered incredible. Doing it from a Sherman tank facing backward should have been impossible. Jake took his time with this one. He checked everything twice. Made his calculations, then checked them again. Finally, he was ready. Fire, the wait felt like forever. Then the distant target exploded into pieces. The crowd erupted. Some people cheered. Others just stood with their mouths open. Mike and Tommy were jumping up and down inside the tank. Final target, 15. 1,000 yards, small target, Jake called out. The last target was only half the size of the others. It was the kind of shot that nobody expected him to make. But Jake was not just trying to pass this test anymore. He was trying to prove something bigger. He was showing that thinking differently could win battles. He aimed carefully. This was his last chance to make an impression. He thought about everything that had led to this moment. All the failures, all the doubt, all the pressure. He channeled it all into this one shot, fire. The small target vanished in a cloud of smoke and splinters. 15 targets, 15 direct hits. Perfect score. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Jimmy started clapping. Tommy and Mike joined in. Soon, even some of the doubters in the crowd were applauding. It was impossible to deny what they had just witnessed. Captain Henderson walked up to the tank, shaking his head in amazement. Sergeant Morrison, in 20 years of Army service, that's the most impressive display of gunnery I've ever seen. And also the strangest. Jake climbed out of the turret. Thank you, sir. Explain to me exactly what you're doing differently. I want every detail, Henderson ordered. Jake spent the next 30 minutes explaining his technique. He described how he had discovered the problem, how he developed his backward calculations, how he compensated for the reversed angles. He was honest about it being difficult and requiring a lot of practice. The mechanics listened carefully and took notes. The gunnery instructor asked technical questions. Other tank commanders gathered around, suddenly very interested in what Jake had figured out. The question is, does this work only for your tank, or could other crews use it? Henderson asked. Sir, I think any tank with a similar stabilization defect could benefit from this method. It would require testing other Shermans to see which ones have the problem, Jake answered. Henderson nodded slowly. Lieutenant Davis, I want Morrison's tank and crew assigned to the next combat operation. A real mission, not training. I want to see if this works under actual battle conditions. Yes, sir, Davis replied. He looked at Jake with something that might have been respect. Morrison, understand this. What you've shown here today is remarkable. But the training range is controlled, safe. Combat is chaos. If this backward setup gets you killed because you can't maneuver properly, all this means nothing, Henderson warned. I understand, sir, but I think this can save lives, not cost them. Give me a chance to prove it in the field, Jake said firmly. Henderson studied him for a long moment. All right, Sergeant. You'll get your chance. There's an operation planned for 3 days from now. Infantry needs support taking a town called Beaumont. German armor and anti-tank positions have our boys pinned down. You and your crew will provide long-range fire support. We'll be ready, sir, Jake promised. As the crowd dispersed, Jake's crew gathered around him. They were all grinning, proud of what they had accomplished together. Dude, that was insane. 15 for 15, Mike said excitedly. Now we just have to do it when people are shooting back at us, Jimmy said with a slight smile. You'll do great, Sarge. We all will, Tommy added. Jake looked at his Sherman tank, still facing backward on the range. It looked wrong, awkward, broken. But Jake knew better now. Sometimes what looked wrong was actually right. Sometimes solving a problem meant looking at it from a completely different angle. The other tank crews were watching him now with new eyes. Some with respect, some with curiosity, a few still with doubt. That was okay. In 3 days, Jake Morrison would have his chance to show everyone that sometimes the craziest ideas were the ones that won wars. He just had to survive long enough to prove it. And with his backward setup, Jake finally believed he could. The morning of September 28th started with rain. Cold, miserable rain that turned the French countryside into a muddy mess. Jake Morrison sat in his Sherman tank, watching water run down the outside of the turret. His crew was quiet, each man lost in his own thoughts. Today was the day. Today they would find out if Jake's backward setup worked in real combat, or if it would get them all killed. The town of Beaumont sat in a valley about 3 miles ahead. Intelligence reports said German forces had dug in there 2 weeks ago. They had Panther tanks, anti-tank guns, and machine gun positions covering all the approaches. American infantry had tried to take the town twice already. Both times they had been pushed back with heavy casualties. Now it was the armor's turn to help. Lieutenant Davis's voice crackled over the radio. All units, this is Leader. The plan is simple. Morrison's tank will position on the ridge overlooking Beaumont. You'll provide long-range fire support while the other tanks and infantry advance from the east. Your job is to take out enemy armor and anti-tank positions before they can hit our boys. Understood, sir, Jake replied. Morrison, you're hanging back because of your supposed accuracy advantage. Don't make me regret this decision, Davis added. No, sir. We won't let you down, Jake promised. The Sherman rumbled forward through the mud. Mike drove carefully, avoiding the worst of the terrain. They were part of a column of 6 tanks. But as they got closer to Beaumont, Jake's tank split off from the group. They headed for a ridge on the western side of the valley, while the other tanks continued east. As they climbed the ridge, Jake could see the town below. Beaumont was small, maybe 50 buildings clustered around a church. Smoke rose from several locations. Through his binoculars, Jake could see German positions. They had set up well, using the buildings for cover and creating overlapping fields of fire. There, Jimmy pointed. 3 o'clock, about 800 yards. That looks like a Panther tank hull down behind that stone wall. Jake looked. Sure enough, a German Panther tank was partially hidden with only its turret and gun visible. The Panther was one of the most dangerous tanks in the German army. Its armor was thick and its gun could destroy a Sherman from over a mile away. In a fair fight, the Panther usually won, but Jake was not planning a fair fight. "Mike, turn us around. Rear facing the town," Jake ordered. "You sure about this, Sarge? That position makes us vulnerable if we need to run," Mike said nervously. "We're not running. We're hunting," Jake replied with confidence he did not entirely feel. The Sherman turned until its rear faced the valley. To anyone watching, it looked like they were retreating or had made a terrible mistake. But Jake knew better. This was his advantage. He climbed into the gunner's position and looked through his sight. The Panther tank was clearly visible at 800 yards. He began his calculations, adjusting for the backward position, wind, distance, and angle. "Tommy, load armor piercing," Jake ordered. "Loaded," Tommy confirmed seconds later. Jake took a breath. This was different from the training range. That Panther had a crew of 5 men inside, men who had families who wanted to go home just like Jake did. But this was war. If Jake did not kill them first, they would kill American soldiers. Maybe even Jake's friends in the infantry below. He pushed the thoughts away and focused. Math, angles, calculations. This was just another problem to solve. Target, enemy armor, 800 yards. "Firing," Jake announced. The cannon roared. The Sherman rocked backward from the recoil. Jake watched through his sight as the shell flew through the air in a perfect arc. It struck the Panther's turret with a thunderous clang. The German tank did not explode, but smoke started pouring from it. A moment later, the crew began bailing out. "Direct hit. That Panther is done," Jimmy shouted. "Target 2, anti-tank gun, 700 yards behind the church," Jake called out, already moving to the next target. He had spotted the anti-tank gun earlier. It was a German 75mm position to cover the eastern approach where the American tanks would attack from. If that gun stayed active, it would destroy Shermans before they could get close. Jake calculated quickly. This had to be fast. The Germans now knew someone was shooting at them from the ridge. They would start looking for him soon. "Loaded," Tommy yelled. "Firing!" Another roar. The shell screamed downrange and exploded right next to the anti-tank gun. The gun flew sideways, its crew scattered or dead. Jake did not wait to see the result. Target 3, machine gun nest, 600 yards, second floor of the building with the blue door. Jake continued. He was in his zone now. The same mental space where he had been during the demonstration. Everything else faded away except the targets and the math. Fire, reload, calculate, fire again. A 4th target went down, a 5th, a 6th. Then the Germans started shooting back. A shell exploded about 30 yards in front of the Sherman, throwing mud everywhere. Another whistled overhead. The Germans had spotted them and were trying to hit back. "Jake, we got company. Another Panther, 900 yards, coming around from the north side of town," Jimmy called out urgently. Jake swung the turret to the new target. 900 yards was far even for him. And this Panther was moving, which made it much harder to hit. He had maybe 10 seconds before the German tank found a good firing position. His mind raced through calculations. Moving target, long distance, wind from the east, slight uphill angle from the target's position. His hands moved automatically, adjusting the gun's elevation and traverse. Loaded. Tommy was breathing hard but staying calm. Jake waited. The Panther was moving behind a building. In 3 seconds, it would emerge on the other side. That was when Jake had to shoot. If he waited for a clear shot, the Panther would stop and fire first. Sherman armor could not stop a Panther's gun at this range. He counted in his head. 3, 2, 1, fire. The shell left the gun just as the Panther's front armor appeared from behind the building. The German tank was still moving when Jake's shell struck it in the lower front plate, one of the few weak points on a Panther. The tank stopped moving suddenly. Smoke poured from the engine compartment. "Holy, you hit a moving target at 900 yards. Mike screamed into the intercom, but Jake was not celebrating. Target anti-tank gun 850 yards on the hill behind town. He had spotted a third anti-tank gun trying to get into position. This one was dangerous because it had a clear view of where the American tanks would be advancing. Jake had to take it out. The next 10 minutes were chaos. Jake fired, Tommy loaded, Jimmy called out targets, and Mike kept the tank positioned perfectly. Shells from German guns exploded around them, but none found their mark. The Germans could not hit what they could not judge the distance to properly, and Jake's backward position confused their spotters. One by one, Jake eliminated the German positions. A third Panther tank died. 4 more anti-tank guns were destroyed. 3 machine gun nests were silenced. Each shot Jake made was precise, calculated, and deadly. Finally, Lieutenant Davis's voice came over the radio. "Morrison, cease fire! The infantry is advancing. Your fire support was exceptional. Enemy resistance has collapsed. They're retreating." Jake sat back in his seat, suddenly aware that he was soaking with sweat despite the cold rain outside. His hands were shaking from adrenaline. "How many did we get?" Tommy asked. Jimmy had been keeping count. 3 Panther tanks, 7 anti-tank guns, and at least 5 machine gun positions. 14 targets total. All direct hits. And we never got touched. 14 targets, Mike repeated in awe. "Dude, we just became legends." Through his sight, Jake could see American infantry moving into Beaumont. The Germans were pulling back, their defensive line broken. How many American soldiers would go home because Jake had taken out those enemy positions? How many families would see their sons again because of his backward setup? "All tanks advance into town. Morrison, hold position until we secure the area," Davis ordered. As they waited, Jake climbed out of the turret to get some air. The rain had stopped and weak sunlight broke through the clouds. He looked down at Beaumont, watching American soldiers move through the streets. Jimmy climbed out and stood next to him. "You know this changes everything, right? What you did today, other crews are going to want to learn it. Hell, command is probably going to study your technique." "Good," Jake said simply. "If it saves lives, they should." An hour later, the town was secure. Jake's tank rolled down from the ridge and entered Beaumont. Soldiers stopped to watch them pass. Some waved. A few saluted. Word had already spread about the crazy gunner who fought with his tank facing backward and destroyed everything in sight. Captain Henderson was waiting in the town square. He walked up to Jake's tank as it stopped. "Morrison, I just got reports from 3 different infantry commanders. They all say your fire support saved their men. One captain said you took out a Panther that had them pinned down before they even knew it was there." Henderson said. "Just doing my job, sir," Jake replied. "No, Sergeant. You did a lot more than your job. You proved that innovation and thinking differently can change the outcome of battles. I'm recommending you and your crew for commendations. I'm also ordering a full study of your technique. If other tanks have similar defects, we need to know about it," Henderson announced. Jake felt pride surge through him, but he kept his expression calm. "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me yet. Word is spreading fast. Every tank commander in the division is going to want to know your secret. You're going to be busy teaching people your backward setup," Henderson said with a slight smile. As Henderson walked away, Jake's crew gathered around him. They were all exhausted, dirty, and soaking wet. But they were also alive, victorious, and part of something special. "So what do we do now?" Tommy asked. Jake looked at his Sherman tank, still facing backward in the town square. He thought about all the crews who might benefit from what he had learned. All the lives that might be saved. Now we teach others. And we keep fighting. Because this war isn't over yet, Jake said firmly. The sun broke through the clouds fully now, shining down on the liberated town of Beaumont. Sergeant Jake Morrison and his crew had proven that sometimes the best way forward was to face backward. And in doing so, they had changed tank warfare forever. 2 weeks had passed since the battle at Beaumont. 2 weeks that had changed Sergeant Jake Morrison's life completely. He was not just a tank gunner anymore. He had become something else entirely. He had become a teacher. Jake stood in front of a classroom in a temporary building near the battalion headquarters. 30 tank gunners from different crews sat in front of him, notebooks open, pencils ready. They were all eager to learn the technique that had destroyed 14 German positions in a single battle. But teaching was harder than Jake expected. The key is understanding that the stabilization system has a flaw in some Sherman models, Jake explained, pointing to a diagram on the blackboard behind him. When the tank moves forward, there's a tiny wobble in the gun mount that throws off your calculations. It's so small that most people never notice it, but at long range that tiny wobble makes a huge difference. A gunner in the front row raised his hand. "But Sergeant Morrison, how do we know if our tank has this flaw?" "You test it," Jake replied. "Take your tank to a range and fire at targets from 600 yards or more. If you're consistently missing in the same direction, you might have the defect. Then you try the backward setup and see if your accuracy improves." Another hand went up. "What if our tank doesn't have the defect? Will the backward method still work?" Jake paused. "That was a good question. Honestly, I don't know yet. The engineers are still studying this. But what I do know is that understanding your specific tank's quirks will make you a better gunner, no matter what." After the class, Lieutenant Davis was waiting outside. "Morrison, I need to talk to you." They walked together toward the motor pool where the tanks were maintained. Davis had been different since Beaumont. Less cold, more respectful. He treated Jake like an equal now instead of a problem to be solved. "The battalion commander wants to see you tomorrow. Captain Henderson and some engineers from Army Ordnance are coming to examine your tank," Davis said. "What for?" Jake asked. "They want to understand exactly what's wrong with it. If they can identify the defect, they can check other tanks and fix the problem before it costs more lives," Davis explained. "Your discovery might be bigger than just a shooting technique, Morrison. It might expose a manufacturing flaw that affects hundreds of tanks." Jake had not thought about it that way. His backward setup had started as a desperate attempt to save his own career. Now it might help the entire Army improve their equipment. The next morning, Jake met with Captain Henderson and 3 engineers in civilian clothes. They spent 4 hours examining Jake's Sherman, measuring every component, checking tolerances, and testing the stabilization system in ways Jake did not understand. Finally, the lead engineer, a thin man with thick glasses named Dr. Patterson, approached Jake with a serious expression. "Sergeant Morrison, you were right. Your tank has a defect in the gyroscopic stabilizer assembly. The mount has a 3-degree deviation that only appears under certain stress conditions. It's subtle enough that it passed inspection, but significant enough to affect accuracy at range," Dr. Patterson explained. "Can it be fixed?" Jake asked. "Yes, but it requires replacing the entire stabilizer assembly. That's a 6-hour job minimum," Patterson replied. "The concerning part is that we don't know how many other tanks have this same defect. We're going to recommend checking every Sherman in the division." Henderson nodded thoughtfully. "And in the meantime, Morrison's backward technique serves as a workaround for any tank with similar issues." "Exactly," Patterson agreed. Sergeant Morrison essentially developed a field solution to an engineering problem. That's remarkably innovative. Over the next week, Jake became famous throughout the division. Other crews started calling his tank the backward beast. Some crews tested their tanks and discovered they had similar defects. Jake taught them his technique, spending hours with each gunner until they understood the backward calculations. But not everyone was happy about Jake's fame. One evening, Jake was eating dinner in the mess tent when another sergeant named Frank Hughes sat down across from him. Hughes was a veteran tanker who had fought in North Africa. He had a reputation for being tough and traditional. "Morrison, can I ask you something?" Hughes said, his tone challenging. "Sure," Jake replied carefully. "Do you really think your backward stunt is some kind of revolution, or is it just a trick that works for your specific tank?" Hughes asked. Jake put down his fork. "It's not a trick. It's a solution to a real problem. If it works, it works. See, here's my issue," Hughes continued. "You're teaching green gunners to fight with their tanks facing backward. That's dangerous. What happens when they need to advance quickly? What happens when they're taking fire and need to retreat? Your method leaves them vulnerable. That's why you pick your position carefully. You use the backward setup for long-range support, not close combat," Jake explained. "And you think scared kids are going to remember that distinction in the middle of a battle?" Hughes challenged. "I think you're setting people up to get killed, Morrison. You got lucky at Beaumont. Don't mistake luck for skill." Jake felt anger rising in his chest, but he kept his voice calm. "I hit 14 targets at ranges up to 900 yards. That wasn't luck. That was math, practice, and understanding my equipment." "It was one battle," Hughes said, standing up. "Let's see if you can do it again before you start acting like you reinvented tank warfare." As Hughes walked away, Tommy sat down next to Jake. "Don't listen to him. Sarge, he's just jealous." "Maybe he's right, though," Jake said quietly. Maybe I am putting people at risk by teaching them something unconventional. You're giving them a tool that might save their lives, Tommy argued. That's not putting them at risk. That's giving them options. Jake appreciated Tommy's support, but Hughes's words stayed with him. Was he being responsible? Was his technique really revolutionary? Or was it just a temporary solution that would get people killed in the wrong situation? He got his answer 3 days later. A tank crew from Baker Company had learned Jake's backward technique. They were part of an operation to clear German forces from a forest area. During the battle, their Sherman got separated from the other tanks. They found themselves facing 3 German anti-tank guns hidden in the tree line. The crew commander, a young lieutenant named Walsh, made a decision. He ordered his tank to reverse position and use Jake's technique. From 800 yards, the gunner eliminated all 3 anti-tank guns before the Germans could get a shot off. Walsh's tank then repositioned and rejoined the advance. Walsh personally came to find Jake that evening. "Morrison, I need to thank you. Your technique saved my crew today. We were in a bad spot and the backward setup gave us the accuracy to fight our way out." "You used it correctly," Jake said. "You picked your moment, took your shots, then repositioned. That's exactly how it should be used." "I know some people are criticizing you, saying the technique is dangerous," Walsh continued. "But those people don't understand. You're not telling everyone to fight backward all the time. You're teaching us that sometimes a different approach is the best approach. That's valuable." Word of Walsh's success spread. More crews wanted to learn from Jake. Even some of the skeptics started to come around. Frank Hughes never apologized, but Jake noticed he stopped criticizing publicly. Captain Henderson called Jake to his office one afternoon. "Morrison, I have news. Army Ordnance has completed their study. They found that approximately 12% of Sherman tanks from a specific production batch have the stabilizer defect. That's hundreds of tanks across the European theater." "That's a lot of tanks, sir," Jake said, surprised. "It is. They're working on a repair program, but it will take months to fix them all. In the meantime, your backward technique is being officially added to the tank crew training manual as an alternative firing method for long-range engagement," Henderson announced. Jake was stunned. "My technique is going in the manual?" "Not exactly your technique anymore," Henderson said with a smile. "It's being called reverse position engagement, or RPE for short. But yes, you're the one who figured it out. That's going in the historical record." "I just wanted to hit my targets, sir. I never thought it would become something this big," Jake admitted. "The best innovations usually start that way," Henderson replied. "Someone has a problem, they think differently, and they find a solution. You did that, Morrison. You should be proud." 1 month after the battle at Beaumont, Jake and his crew were called to battalion headquarters. They thought it was for another training session. Instead, they found themselves standing in formation in front of the entire battalion. Captain Henderson stood before them with Lieutenant Davis. Henderson held several small boxes. Sergeant Jake Morrison, Corporal James Walker, Corporal Mike Rodriguez, and Private Tommy Chen stepped forward. Henderson ordered. They marched forward, confused but disciplined. Henderson opened the boxes to reveal Bronze Star medals inside. "For exceptional performance in combat and innovative thinking under pressure, it is my honor to present these medals," Henderson announced. "Sergeant Morrison, your discovery and subsequent actions at Beaumont resulted in the neutralization of 14 enemy positions and saved countless American lives. Your crew's performance exemplifies the best of American ingenuity and courage." As Henderson pinned the Bronze Star on Jake's uniform, Jake thought about the long journey that had led here. The failures, the doubt, the desperate experiments in that abandoned field. The moment when he realized his tank was not broken, it was just different. And that different could be better. After the ceremony, Jake stood with his crew looking at their medals. Tommy was grinning ear to ear. Mike kept touching his medal like he could not believe it was real. Jimmy just stood quietly proud. "So what happens now?" Tommy asked. "Do they make us instructors permanently?" "I hope not," Jake said. "I'm a tanker, not a teacher. We've got a war to win. Think they'll ever fix our tank?" Mike wondered. "If they replace the stabilizer, will we still be able to use the backward method?" "If they fix it, we won't need to," Jake replied. "But honestly, I hope we still can. It works." Lieutenant Davis approached them. "Morrison, I owe you an apology. When this all started, I thought you were making excuses for poor performance. I was wrong. You were identifying and solving a real problem. "Thank you, sir," Jake said. "I also want you to know that your technique is being used successfully by crews across the division now. Last week alone, 4 different tanks used reverse position engagement to destroy enemy armor at long range. Your innovation is saving lives every day," Davis continued. As Jake walked back to his Sherman tank that evening, he felt a sense of peace he had not felt in months. He was not the failure he had thought he was. He was not the broken gunner who could not hit targets. He was the soldier who had looked at a problem from a different angle. The tanker who had turned a weakness into a strength. The gunner who had proven that sometimes the best way forward was to face backward. His Sherman tank sat in the motor pool, cleaned and maintained. Jake climbed up on the hull and sat there, looking at his machine. It was scarred from battle now, with scratches and dents that told stories of combat, but it ran well, and more importantly, it fought well. "You and me," Jake said quietly to the tank. "We figured something out together. You showed me your problem, and I found the solution. Thanks for that." It was silly talking to a machine, but Jake did not care. That machine had kept him alive. That machine had made him famous. That machine had helped him save lives. The war was not over. There would be more battles, more challenges, more problems to solve. But Jake Morrison knew something now that he had not known before. Sometimes the answer to a problem is not fixing what is broken. Sometimes the answer is understanding what is different and learning to use that difference as strength. His backward setup had transformed his Sherman into something special. A sniper tank that could hit targets other tanks could not reach. A weapon that destroyed everything in its path, but more than that, it had transformed Jake. From a struggling gunner to an innovator. From someone who followed the rules to someone who wrote new ones. From a sergeant worried about failure to a soldier who changed how the army fought. As the sun set over the French countryside, Jake Morrison sat on his tank and smiled. Hughes had been wrong. This was not luck. This was not a trick. This was the result of never giving up, thinking differently, and believing that there was always a solution if you were willing to look for it, even if that solution was backward.